Here's what to do if someone tries to correct your pronunciation of a word. As a linguist who talks about different pronunciations, this happens to me all the time. Here's my advice on how to deal with it. Now, if you mispronounce something in another language, fine. Should you do your best to pronounce words in a foreign language correctly? Sure, absolutely. That's just the respectful thing to do. And if you want help with that, I recommend going to Wikipedia. Wikipedia has pronunciations for most words written in the International Phonetic Alphabet, so that's very useful. But also, every language has different sound systems, and if I'm not a native speaker or fluent in that language, I'm going to pronounce it with an accent. If it's a word that's been borrowed into English from another language and people are still griping about it, well, that's a different story. Because languages have different sound systems, whenever we borrow a word from one language into another, we adapt the pronunciation of that word to the new language. So yes, it's pronounced croissant in French, but it's pronounced croissant in English. Croissant and croissant are two different words in two different languages. And meanings often change when words are borrowed too. The word latte means milk in Italian, but refers to a specific type of milk drink in English. Again, two different words, two different meanings, two different languages. Okay, but what about words in your own language? What do you do when someone tells you you're pronouncing a word in your own native language wrong? First off, you should know that your own pronunciation is totally valid and correct. Unless we're talking about one-off slips or mistakes, a native speaker can't mispronounce their own language, and they don't speak their own language ungrammatically. The rules of language come from the way that people actually speak, not from dictionaries and grammar textbooks. Dictionaries and grammar textbooks simply document the way that people actually do use language, and because of that, they often lag behind usage by decades or generations. And just like any social convention, language varies by demographic and it changes over time. There are always competing conventions in language, and that is totally normal, totally natural, totally fine. There's no empirical or scientific basis for the notion that some ways of speaking are better or more correct than others. All languages and all dialects are just as equally complex. They all have grammatical rules, even if those rules sometimes vary from region to region. Language is a complex adaptive system that's always changing, so there's just inherently variation in the system. The majority of people simply aren't aware that that variation exists simply because they haven't had a lot of exposure to other ways of speaking. Or if they are aware of that variation, they associate it with different outsider groups who they have negative opinions about. And there are different levels of awareness of linguistic diversity too. So at the most basic level, people think, I don't have an accent. Everyone speaks like me. Mine is the only correct way of speaking. At the next level, it's, I've just encountered this way of speaking for the first time and I don't like it. I find it weird. I'm going to blame X group of people for this and say that it happens because of this stereotype about those people. People generally use language to justify the pre-existing ideas they have about other people. Things that I've had said to me include, black people just say ax instead of ask because they're lazy or stupid. Young women just use uptalk because they're desperate for attention. Americans say things wrong because they have a terrible education system. In reality, the ax pronunciation has been in usage for just as long as the ask pronunciation. This is a very normal sound change where two sounds switch places with each other, called metathesis. Other examples are that we now say comfortable instead of comfortable, and introduce instead of introduce. Uptalk, speaking with rising intonation at the end of a sentence, probably has more to do with influence from Spanish speakers in California and the prosody of Spanish than it does with anything to do about the speaker's confidence. And Americans speak differently than Brits because our dialects have been diverging for 300 years. And oftentimes, the American version is more representative of the older way of speaking than the British version is. In certain ways, British English has changed more drastically than American English has. Now, a slightly higher level of awareness of linguistic diversity is when people say, why do people say things this way? And what they generally mean by that is, well, I'm aware that people say this differently, and I'm kind of resigned to the fact that I have to live with this. I still think it's weird and I don't like it. And the highest level of linguistic enlightenment is when they've had enough exposure to different ways of speaking that they realize that everybody has an accent, everybody has a dialect, everybody speaks differently, including themselves. People just say things differently depending on where they're from. So I think it's really helpful to understand why people have these ideas they do about language, but let's talk specifics about ways you can respond to common misconceptions. First off, if someone says nobody ever says it that way, or I've never heard anyone say that, first off, that's kind of like saying, I can't believe Nixon won. I don't know anyone who voted for him. It's just factually incorrect and shows that they're probably a little sheltered. And just show them that other pronunciations exist. One of the ways I like to do this is show them graphics from this book, Speaking American. It's got maps of different ways that people say things and pronounce things all over the United States. Showing them a map like this for soda, pop, and Coke gets them to realize, oh, this isn't just some one-off random thing that people say in some isolate backwater. There are actually a lot of people that choose to say things this way. Another common justification that a certain way of speaking is more correct is to say that the other way of speaking is more informal, but informal language is still language. It just has a limited range of social contexts, but all language has a limited range of social contexts. Think about if you tried to speak really formally with your closest friends. They would think you were mad at them. It goes both ways. Both formal and informal language have their place. And what used to be considered informal is often today considered formal. People will also criticize something as being slang. All new language starts out as slang. Sometimes people will say that because most people say it that way, that's the correct way. One of the easiest ways to debunk this idea is to simply look up the usage, and a lot of times they're in the minority and they didn't even realize it. You can also look up the history of the word or expression, and usually at some point that use of the word or that pronunciation of the word would have been in the minority in the past. Or you can just point out the fact that language isn't a majority rules kind of thing. Competing conventions exist. Personally, I've never found this convincing for anybody, but you should say it anyway. If they're British, though, a really good argument is to say that, well, if majority rules, then shouldn't the Brits just all be speaking American English because there's more speakers of American English than British English? One of the most frequent fallacies is to think that the older or more traditional pronunciation or use of a word is more correct. And there was actually a recent study that showed that people think the most correct period for a language happens to be the period where they were growing up in. But if people think that the traditional or older version of a word is more correct, you can do a reductio ad absurdum. You can just go further back in time than they did. If they say that the traditional pronunciation is pecan rather than pecan, you can point out that the even older pronunciation was the Cree pronunciation of pecan. If they say that the traditional pronunciation is crayon rather than crayon, you can point out that the even older pronunciation is crayon from French. And finally, a lot of people will point to a dictionary as a source, but as I've already mentioned, dictionaries only document the way people actually use language. They don't dictate how people ought to use language. Again, dictionaries often lag behind usage by decades or generations. My overall piece of advice, though, is teach, don't argue. Explaining the linguistic situation and/or how it got that way tends to get people to chill out a little about it. Also, make sure you're not arguing for a correct pronunciation yourself. So you can describe which demographics are associated with an expression, which geographic areas are associated with an expression. You can describe the history of the expression. You can usually appeal to Wiktionary because Wiktionary often documents multiple dialects and multiple pronunciations for a thing. But you do also just have to be prepared to accept that most people are never going to get over this idea of a correct language. So if you're replying to a commenter, remember that your reply isn't necessarily for them. It's for everybody else in the virtual room who's listening. Use it as a teaching moment for the others who are there. And finally, one resource you can recommend that tackles a lot of these myths really well is a book called Language Myths by Lori Bauer and Peter Trudgell. It's a little dated, but I still think it's the best book out there that addresses these issues. It's really accessible. It's got little bite-sized chapters. It's a fun read. People generally come away from it saying, wow, I never knew those things about language. It's the first book I give anybody when they start taking an interest in language or linguistics. I hope you enjoyed this bonus video. I hope this was useful to you, and thank you very much for being a supporter of Linguistic Discovery. It helps me teach the world a little bit more about the science and diversity of language, so thank you.